Makassan trepangers from the southwest corner of Sulawesi, Indonesia visited the coast of northern Australia from at least the 18th century to collect and process trepang, a marine invertebrate prized for its culinary and medicinal values in Chinese markets. The term Makassan is generally used to apply to all the trepangers who came to Australia, although some were from other islands in the Indonesian Archipelago, including Timor, Rote and Aru. Fishing and processing of trepang, a creature and the food product commonly known as sea cucumber, beach de mer in French, trepang in Indonesian, gamat in Malaysian. Trepang live on the sea floor and are exposed at low tide. Fishing was traditionally done by hand, spearing, diving or dredging. The catch was placed in boiling water before being dried and smoked, to preserve the trepang for the journey back to Makassan and other Southeast Asian markets. Trepang is still valued by Chinese communities for its jelly-like texture, its flavor-enhancing properties, and as a stimulant and aphrodisiac. Matthew Flinders made a contemporary record of how trepang was processed when he met a Makassan fleet in February 1803. The voyage to Mirage and Kayu Jawa. Fishing fleets began to visit the northern coasts of Australia from Makassar in southern Sulawesi, Indonesia from about 1720, but possibly earlier. While Campbell McKnight's classic study of the Makassan trepang industry accepts the start of the industry as about 1720, with the earliest recorded trepang voyage made in 1751. Regina Ganter of Griffith University notes a Sulawesi historian who suggests a commencement date for the industry of about 1640. Ganter also notes that for some anthropologists, the extensive impact of the trepang industry on the Yolngu people suggests a longer period of contact. Arnhem Land rock art, recorded by archaeologists in 2008, appears to provide further evidence of Makassan contact in the mid-1600s. Contact has even been proposed from as early as the 1500s. At the height of the trepang industry, Makassans ranged thousands of kilometers along Australia's northern coasts, arriving with the northwest monsoon each December. Makassan Perihu praus could carry a crew of 30 members, and McKnight estimated the total number of trepangers arriving each year as about 1,000. The Makassan crews established themselves at various semi-permanent locations on the coast, to boil and dry the trepang before the return voyage home 4 months later, to sell the cargo to Chinese merchants. Mirage was the Makassan name for Arnhem Land, from the Cobourg Peninsula to Rote Land in the Gulf of Carpentaria. Kayu Jawa was the name for the fishing grounds in the Kimberley region of Western Australia, from Napier Brome Bay to Cape Levesque. Other important fishing areas included West Papua, Sumbawa, Timor and Selayar. Matthew Flinders, in his Circumnavigation of Australia in 1803, met a Makassan trepang fleet near present-day Nulumbai. He communicated at length with a Makassan captain, Pobisu, through his cook, who was also a Malay, and learned of the extent of the trade from this encounter. Ganter adds, 1,000 Makassans must have seen a veritable invasion against the fewer than 7,000 British nestled into Sydney Cove and Newcastle. Nicholas Bowden also encountered 26 large perihu off the northern coast of Western Australia in the same year. Ganter states that the British settlements of Fort Dundas and Fort Wellington were established as a result of Philip Parker King's contact with Makassan trepangers in 1821. Using Dengranka, the last Makassan trepanger to visit Australia, lived well into the 20th century, and the history of his voyages are therefore well documented. He first made the voyage to northern Australia as a young man. He suffered dismasting and several shipwrecks, generally positive but occasionally conflicting relationships with indigenous Australians, and was the first trepanger to pay the South Australian government a trepanging licence in 1883, an impost that made the trade less viable. The trade continued to dwindle toward the end of the 19th century, due to the imposition of customs duties and licence fees, and probably compounded by overfishing. Using Dengranka commanded the last Makassar Perahu, which left Arnhem Land in 1907. Physical evidence of Makassan contact. Archaeological remains of Makassar processing plants from the 18th and 19th centuries are still at Port Essington, in Aru Bay and Rote Land, along with stands of the Makassan introduced tamarind trees. McKnight and others note these areas have produced pieces of metal, broken pottery and glass coins, fish hooks and broken clay pipes. McKnight notes that much of the ceramic material found suggests a 19th century date. In 1916, 2 bronze cannons were found on a small island in Napier Brome Bay on the northern coast of Western Australia. Scientists at the Western Australian Museum in Fremantle have made a detailed analysis and have determined that these weapons are swivel guns and, almost certainly of late 18th century Makassan, rather than European origin. Flinders' account confirms that the Makassans he met were personally armed and the Perahus carried small cannons. In January 2012, a swivel gun found 2 years before at Dundee Beach near Darwin was widely reported by web news sources and the Australian press to be of Portuguese origin. However, initial analysis by the Museum and Art Gallery of the Northern Territory indicates it is probably also of Southeast Asian origin. The museum holds 7 guns of Southeast Asian manufacture in its collections. Another swivel gun of Southeast Asian manufacture, found in Darwin in 1908, is held by the Museum of South Australia, and is also possibly of Makassan origin. There is significant evidence of contact with Makassan fishes in rock art and bark painting of northern Australia, with the Makassan Perahu a prominent feature. Effect on indigenous people of Australia. The Makassar contact with Aborigines had a significant effect on their culture. Ganter writes, the cultural imprint on the Yolngu people of this contact is everywhere, in the language, in their art, in the stories, in their cuisine. Quote, according to anthropologist John Bradley from Monash University, the contact between the two groups was a success. They traded together. It was fair. There was no racial judgment, no race policy. Even into the early 21st century, the shared history between the two peoples is still celebrated by Aboriginal communities in Northern Australia as a period of mutual trust and respect. Others who have studied this period have come to a different conclusion regarding the relationship between the Aboriginal people and the visiting trepangers. Anthropologist Ian McIntosh has said that the initial effects of contact with the Makassan fishermen resulted in turmoil, with the extent of Islamic influence being noteworthy. In another paper, McIntosh concludes, strife, poverty and domination is a previously unrecorded legacy of contact between Aborigines and Indonesians. A report prepared by the History Department of the Australian National University says that the Makassans appear to have been welcomed initially. However, relations deteriorated when Aborigines began to feel they were being exploited, leading to violence on both sides. Trade studies by anthropologists have found traditions that indicate Makassans negotiated for the right to fish certain waters. The exchange also involved the trade of cloth, tobacco, metal axes and knives, rice and gin. The Yolngu of Arnhem Land also traded turtle shell, pearls and cypress pine, and some were employed as trepangers. While there is ample evidence of peaceful contact, some contact was hostile. using Dengranka described at least one violent confrontation with Aborigines, while Flinders heard advice from the Makassans to beware of the natives. However, rock art and bark paintings appear to confirm that some Aboriginal workers willingly accompanied the Makassar back to the homeland of South Sulawesi, Indonesia across the Arafura Sea. Women were also occasional items of exchange according to Denise Russell, but the views and experiences have not been recorded. After visiting Groot Eland in the early 1930s, anthropologist Donald Thompson speculated that the traditional seclusion of women from strange men and the use of portable bark screens may have been a result of contact with Makassans' health. It is possible that smallpox was introduced to northern Australia via Makassan contact in the 1820s. This remains unproven, as first feet smallpox was already spreading across Australia from Sydney Co. Economic. Some Yolngu communities of Arnhem Land appear to have refigured their economies from being largely land-based to largely sea-based with the introduction of Makassar technologies such as dugout canoes, which were highly prized. These seaworthy boats, unlike the traditional bark canoes, allowed Yolngu to fish the ocean for dugongs and turtles. McKnight notes that both the dugout canoe and shovel-nosed spear found in Arnhem Land were based on Makassarese prototypes. Language. A Makassan pidgin became a lingua franca along the north coast, not just between Makassan and Aboriginal people, but also between different Aboriginal groups, who were brought into greater contact with each other by the seafaring Makassar culture. Words from the Makassarese language can still be found in Aboriginal language varieties of the North Coast. Examples include rupiah, jammer, and belanda, which originally came to the Makassar language via the Malay Orang Belanda. Religion. Regina Ganter and Peter Stevenson, drawing on the work of Ian McIntosh, argue that aspects of Islam were creatively adapted by the Yolngu, and Muslim references survive in certain ceremonies and dreaming stories today. Stevenson speculates that the Makassans may have also been the first to bring Islam to Australia. According to anthropologist John Bradley from Monash University, if you go to northeast Arnhem Land, there is in song, it is there in painting, it is there in dance, it is there in funeral rituals. It is patently obvious that there are borrowed items. With linguistic analysis as well, you're hearing hymns to Allah, or at least certain prayers to Allah. Current situation. Though prevented from fishing across Arnhem Land, other Indonesian fishermen have continued to fish up and down the west coast, in what are now Australian waters, as they have done for hundreds of years before such territories were declared, some in traditional boats that their herd parents owned. Such fishing is considered illegal by the present-day Australian government, and since the 1970s, if caught by authorities, the boats are burned and the fishermen are returned to Indonesia. Most Indonesian fishing in Australian waters now occurs around what Australia coined Ashmore Reef and the nearby islands.